Welcome to the Triclinium, a podcast named after the three-sided table used in the Lord's Supper, where you're invited to join the three of us as we think through matters of Christian faith, practice, and community. My name is Jacob Hawley, and I'm here with my co-host Eric Burgers, or as I called him in a previous episode, Eric Burger. Whoops. The pressure got to me. And Nate Leeds. Just kidding, it's Nate Lead. And today, we're going to be talking mostly about the atonement. So we're going to talk about the way in which we have been made one with God again, what that means for us, the different theories of the atonement that are out there, and which one we think is maybe the most important, or whether there's, how we see them all working together. So it'll be a blast. Thanks for joining us. Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Man, I was going to say, I forget what you said. Oh, yeah, me and Nate, we met behind your back, and because you said my name wrong, you're actually fired from the podcast. So,
well, everybody, it's been fun as one of the co-hosts of the Triclinium. I guess I'll see you all later.
Yeah, it's now the Biclinium.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That sounds so much worse. It's actually, that just sounds like the name of a bike shop. The Biclinium. Come bring your bicycle and get it fixed up here. Nate, how are you?
I'm good, man. Yeah, dealing with a little bit of a headache, but I'm happy to be here and work through this conversation, and I'll just suffer through, so.
I'm glad that you're willing to suffer for us, Nate. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, because Christ suffered for us, so.
Oh my gosh.
To bring it back to atonement.
Yeah, and we're back to atonement.
And
Okay, so I will start. Should I start by just outlining the different theories a little bit, so we have some
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful.
Let's
operational. Do it. Okay. So, and it's been I was studying this stuff in college 4 years ago. So have mercy on me if I get this a little bit off.
Good.
So there are kind of 3 or 4 different modes of atonement as they're traditionally understood, or at least three or four different theories. So one of them, the first one, the one that probably most people are the most familiar with, is called penal substitutionary atonement. Penal having to do with penalty, right? So your place in a courtroom and your conviction, what you're charged with, the consequence, right, of your sin. So penal, substitutionary, meaning someone else is coming and taking your place, right? So we would say that Jesus took on the cross, Jesus paid the price for our sins. That's the common mode of atonement that you'll hear, at least in the modern evangelical world. That's the one that most people are familiar with, and then the rest kind of play second fiddle to this one, if we're honest, just culturally. And so the idea is that. And usually there's some Levitical language that gets put into play here as well, but that one would be more just a broader substitutionary atonement, if you're going specifically through Leviticus. But the idea is that God is a just judge, and so God is not going to just turn a blind eye to the terrible doings and dealings of humanity, that we have committed sins and have done wrong things, and that God has this internal, you could say, requirement or obligation, because he is just in his very being, to solve for that, right? So you could say we have a negative balance, we need to bring it back to neutral. And so one of two things can happen. We can be destroyed and killed. We can all suffer the penalty for the sins that we've committed against God. Or we can have somebody else suffer in our place, but somebody has to take that sin and basically create a net positive, you could say, or something like that, and bring us back up to neutral because we're at a negative. Do you have any objections to how I framed that? Is there any way you would frame that differently? For penal substitutionary atonement?
I'm also reading at the same time.
That's okay.
But from what I heard, yeah, that's fine. Gotcha.
Nate give the little thumbs up, and then I got the little FaceTime bubble. That was great. That had the little thumbs up. That was awesome. So that's like the most prominent one, and then the other ones kind of are like satellites that revolve around it and are sometimes mentioned, not as often though. Mm-hmm. The second one, like I said, is probably like a substitutionary atonement more broadly, and has to do kind of with Jesus as the quote-unquote Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. So ties more broadly into the Israelite Levitical system and the symbolism there, and sees Jesus as kind of a like a Day of Atonement animal that's slaughtered.
Are you thinking of the satisfaction theory? Is that what you're getting at with that one?
Describe to me what you mean by satisfaction theory, and then maybe yes.
I mean, it's essentially what you just said.
Okay,
the language of it as it's teased out is, in contrast specifically to penal substitution, there's specific talk of wrath and damnation and the like necessary trade-off, I guess you could say, that Christ provides his people. In penal substitution, satisfaction theory has to do with more of the positive giving of benefits from Christ to his people, and much less focuses upon the negative aspects,
like the
debt specifically. So words like debt or wrath or what else? Just things of that nature, just to put it broadly, are going to be discussed way less in the satisfaction theory.
Interesting.
And that's part of why I wanted to talk about atonement as well. Is because
is that kind of where you're landing a little bit?
No, not necessarily. I still have like texts in Scripture that it just seems too strong to not. Or to just like bat away penal substitutionary atonement, like for me, I understand, and I suspect we'll get into like the implications of how we talk about penal substitutionary atonement and some of the pitfalls, I guess you could say, for that theory. But I don't want to spoil anything. Yeah, I want you to finish talking. So I didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay, well, great, and I'm excited to hear more about that. So I'll just continue here, and actually, Eric and Nate, both of you, if you can be thinking of passages and bringing those up that like might have to do with the atonement, that would be really good, because then we can have some source materials to talk about as we continue the conversation. So we'll say that's penal substitution, and then kind of I would almost call it like Levitical substitution, but then you also brought up kind of that satisfaction theory, which I want to hear more about. A fourth one here that comes to mind is Christus Victor, and this is one that's kind of on the rise right now. It's like it's taking the day in a lot of modern scholarship. Christus Victor is the idea that death had some form of hold on humanity, that death ruled over humanity, and what Jesus was doing when he died on the cross is that he was actually entering down into the deep depths of death itself, and that he was going there in order to rescue those who come out, or those who have been trapped there. And so the way I like to think about this one is it's like the hero who gets swallowed by the dragon only to cut a hole in the dragon and take out those who have been swallowed before him, right? So he's rescuing the captives, you could say, and in the same breath is killing the captor of those captives. So the dragon, death, right? He's stomping out death, and so I think it's a psalm that gets quoted, right? And is it in 1 Corinthians? I might be getting this wrong. Where he says, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Right? That's kind of the essence here of Christus Victor, is that death no longer has the power that it used to have. I'm also thinking Hebrews, I think chapter 2, end of chapter 2, where it's talking about the power of death, that the one who had the power of death was the Greek actually is something like sterilized or neutered, so like devil getting castrated over here, in order that he might not like be able to propagate the power of death anymore. So that's the idea there for that fourth one. So that's Christus Victor. Then you have moral exemplar theory. And moral exemplar theory is one that comes up, I think, probably a lot in like holiness circles, kind of just by default, and also probably in a lot of like pietist and like early Enlightenment Christianity. So the idea that Jesus, what he was really doing was Jesus was a fantastic moral teacher, and yes, he was divine, but the way that he saved us is actually not by doing some sort of metaphysical thing outside of us, but by teaching us the way to conquer death ourselves, or to conquer sin ourselves. And so the way that Jesus saves us is actually by showing us a way. He's a teacher, right? So he you know, it really picks up on that rabbinic idea that Jesus is supposed to represent the wandering teacher who can give you the truth of how to live a good life. And so this one, I mean, like, I think a lot of people see holes. If somebody believes in this one, they have to believe in the other ones as well to almost bolster it, because we know how broken we are as people, and it's kind of hard to convince ourselves that Jesus, the only reason he came was to show us a new way. But it has to play a role in any balanced understanding of the atonement anyways, because there is a way in which Jesus is working in us, or is showing us how to be disciples, right? Those who come after him, right? Any ideas or thoughts on that before I move to the last one that I can remember?
Nope.
Man, you're crushing it.
Yep, keep going.
All right, sweet. We'll take it home here. So this last one, I think is number, did I say 5? Where are we? I don't even remember.
What have you said
5.
so far?
Yeah, 6. Yeah. So we've talked about penal substitution. We've talked about substitution, like in the Levitical sense, which those two kind of are intermixed, but you can have a leaning towards one or the other, and it will change the way that you talk about it a little bit. Then you have satisfaction. You have so that's number 3, and then you have Christus Victor, moral exemplar. So we're at 5, and then this number 6 is like a really old way of understanding the atonement that very few people actually believe now. But there are some elements of this in Scripture that at least need to be addressed, and this one's called ransom theory. So the idea is that basically Satan has ownership over us. We are slaves of sin, right? Or slaves of Satan, or of death, or of the devil, however you want to frame that. Traditionally, it's Satan. And God almost gives Jesus over to the devil in order for us to be let go. So his death on the cross pays not just for like our sins in the divine courtroom, but actually is purchasing us from an entity, which is Satan. So we're being ransomed. It's like we were slaves of sin, and we have been purchased and ransomed out from the grasp of the devil and into the light of Christ, or into ownership of Christ, or the Father through Christ, you could say. So that is ransom theory, and that one was like, I think Origen was one of the main proponents of that one, and I think it just kind of fell by the wayside because there are some problems with God being beholden to Satan, right? But we can still talk about it, because I think there are some notions where like we need to talk about that. I think Romans has some stuff that it says that it's like, this comes pretty close.
That's like Aslan theology from Narnia.
Yes, that's Nate. That is a perfect analogy. Can you describe what you mean by that? Because that's really great.
Yeah, totally. So it was actually not that long ago that Lauren and I rewatched Narnia, and which is a beautiful movie, and everybody should go and rewatch it because it is just excellently done. And so towards the end of the movie, of course I'll spoil it now, but sorry. So Edmund is one of the children in Narnia, and he gets taken prisoner by the what is it? She's a witch.
The White Witch, right?
White
Isn't
Witch? I'm like,
it? Or the
it's not.
shoot, I don't remember.
I know
either.
it's not the Wicked Witch of the West. That's Oz.
No, that's a Dorothy.
Oh, she's like the Winter Queen or Queen of Winter or something like that. The Snow Queen.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right.
Anyway,
I'm gonna look it up. I'll
no,
fact check us while you're going.
yeah. Let's actually get the correct name for our villain here. So Edmund is one of the children who gets taken captive by.
It's the White Witch.
The White
It's
Witch.
the White Witch
in Narnia.
Yeah, Jadis.
And so when
What a
the
name.
White Witch mobilizes her army against the armies of Aslan, and they start to meet on the battlefield, the White Witch goes in for a meeting, and Aslan essentially says, "Okay, you can have me for Edmund." And so then Aslan goes to the stone table, and the White Witch kills him, and Edmund gets released into his brothers and sisters' care. So
That's right.
Yeah.
It's such a, and I mean it is a really powerful scene too, like the way the ritual in which Narnia, I'm not Narnia, Aslan is sacrificed on his behalf, and like all of that. It's very it's very emotionally moving.
I know, yeah.
So
Lauren
if
and
you
I
have
were
not
watching
seen-
it, and we were like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that this is like children's movie. Like it's very
Yes.
like scary and like intense,
Yes.
and all the monsters
Yeah.
are like super like ghoulish and ugly, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is terrifying."
Yeah, it was a bit much for sure. And like yeah, no, I think you really hit on it. I mean, that is a really good. So yeah, if you want to look at that, if you want to watch that, it's the filmed version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's where that scene comes up. And then probably a lot of you have already seen it who are listening, because
But
it's a classic.
I mean, we can continue talking about that, but we can also talk about it later. But yeah, what you said right before that, Jacob, it's weird to think
Mm-hmm.
about God being beholden to Satan or the devil or the evil one, which is interesting. But in the end, it doesn't matter because he reigns over it all, which is interesting. So in a way, I could see the proponents of this theory saying, well, it actually maintains God's character of love and like faithfulness to everyone, really. Even
Yeah.
though he'll reign supreme over the evil one, he doesn't do it by force. He almost plays the game too well.
He does. He
You know?
does. And I think there's probably some Origenist scholars who are kind of trying to bring back that a little bit. But anyways, okay, well, wait, that's just speculation. So now that we have kind of the layout of those theories, I think I said there were 6 that I
Yeah.
put out there.
And there's more too, just to put that out there. There's
Oh yeah.
Did I miss any?
no major one you missed, but just to like kind of rattle off a couple more that I've heard of as well. I don't think you mentioned the moral government theory. I don't think or the governmental theory, as it's sometimes put.
Boy, that does not sound fun. That sounds like something I would not like.
another-
Salvation by committee.
Another more popular one that I actually have heard pop
Salvation by
up
legislation.
here and there is recapitulation, Irenaeus'
yeah.
theory. That's a somewhat big one as well.
That's a good one, yeah. Can you describe recapitulation theory for us?
Oh boy, I wish. Yeah, I mean, the way I'm probably not going to do it justice. I haven't spent much time on Irenaeus' theory, but the way I kind of understand it is it's kind of like Christ making us ready for God, if that makes sense. So, in our like natural state, I suppose, like we are like sinners and unholy before God, whereas Christ in his atoning work like gives us that access to God again, I guess you could say.
So it's almost a sanctification idea.
Kind of, yeah. I actually found a quote from Irenaeus that from
Love it.
an article down. I could read it and maybe it'll shed some light.
Do it.
And he says this, of course, in Against Heresies, his famous work. He says, "For it was for this end that the Word of God was made man, And he who was the Son of God became the Son of Man, that man, having been taken into the Word and receiving the adoption, might become the Son of God. For by no other means could we have attained to incorruptibility and immortality, unless we had been united to incorruptibility and immortality. But how could we be joined to incorruptibility and immortality unless first incorruptibility and immortality had become that which we also are, so that the corruptible might be swallowed up by the incorruptibility, and the mortal by immortality, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So the themes is kind of like I said, preparation. There is sort of the language. It kind of gives a sense of exchange there a little bit, specifically corruptibility for incorruptibility. So Christ is kind of giving us that sort of exchange from we were here and now we're here. He's making us into something new. He's adopting us into something new from where we were previously. Is kind of the flavor that I get for recapitulation in that theory. I think the word adoption is kind of key there in what Irenaeus is saying. But yeah, that's kind of recapitulation in a nutshell, I guess you could say.
That's great. That's awesome. So, and that kind of reminds me of 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that in him we might become the righteousness of God, right? Or, I mean, like, there's the... I think it's like broadly stated. I've heard this, and this might have also been Irenaeus. Just he became what we are, so we might become what he is. Right? That notion.
Yeah.
Little like I mean, there's definitely the what would you say, the blueprints are there for theosis too.
Yeah.
But we can talk about that another
Recapitulation, actually, I believe, is quite popular amongst the Eastern Orthodox Church, if I'm not mistaken, as well. That and the satisfaction theory that I mentioned as well are the two that I think are popular with the Eastern Orthodox. But yeah, I mean, preparation or unity, Christ uniting us to God, I think are like the key words for, or adoption are the key words for recapitulation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. Okay, so now I'm gonna turn it a little bit just to the personal side here, because I think this will be helpful. Like, where have you seen yourself, like, maybe shift in your understanding as you've grown up and, like, have kind of re-encountered the gospel again and again? Because I think there's elements in all of these that are, like, clearly true, right?
Yeah.
And none of them can really become, like, the theory of everything, right? They all kind of need to work together a little bit. And so just for you guys, like, maybe let's talk emphasis, right? What has the emphasis been in your mind, in your imagination of what God has been doing in Christ, in his Son? Like, as you've gotten older, where do you think it was when you were young? Where do you think it is now, right? Like,
yeah,
that kind of shift.
Yeah. For me, I'm still kind of shifting right now, I guess. Like, I ought to do more due diligence, I think, specifically in the text itself, for to take maybe the lens, I guess you could say, of each theory and just try to give it a fair shake by looking at the text itself. Historically, I think my mind has always been that stereotypical evangelical penal substitutionary atonement, but my emphases within that theory, within kind of the sandbox of that theory, you could say, has shifted and is still shifting, I guess you could say. So generally speaking, right now, I can't shake penal substitutionary atonement at the moment. I just the language in Scripture just seems too strong for it not to be like a particular emphasis in my mind. But I would agree with you. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, like, there's elements of truth to almost every theory, and you can say, in some sense, you can sort of be like pantheistic with your atonement theories.
I like that,
because, like,
the only pan
there's going to be texts that, like, clearly, like, seem the holy pan. There's going to be texts
I
that
like
like
cast
clearly
irons.
seem to indicate every theory in certain ways. You know,
Yeah.
you can cherry pick different texts for every single theory, but it has like where everybody disagrees is the implications of how you express the theory, like for different things. So speaking of the shifts that have gone on in my mind, a heavy emphasis, especially in evangelical culture, for penal substitution has to do with the wrath of God and Christ taking on God's wrath on my behalf to some people say it this way, some people don't, but to appease God's wrath is one way you might say it. And I think I would shy away from that language now. I don't like that language anymore.
Yeah, me too.
And even like, so it's funny, and the reason I kind of brought this up is because the East pushes back really hard against penal substitutionary atonement, because they'll say something like, well, okay, Jesus, you're saying Jesus takes on God's wrath. Well, what is the conclusion of what that actually means? And to them, they will say that's damnation. So so they'll say you're saying that Christ was damned, like when taking on God's wrath. And you know, fair question. Honestly, fair question.
Yeah.
And no, we're not saying that. And so my point is, and kind of to wrap up, like where I'm shifting here a little bit is, I'm still comfortable with saying Christ took on God's wrath as long as we're prepared to explain what we mean by that, and stay away from that critique in being going so far as to say that Christ like took on damnation or something like this for us. It can get very dicey in that sort of area. So I don't have a very strong way of attacking penal substitutionary atonement. I guess you could say I'm a bit softer in my view of it. That's kind of me at the moment.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think I want to talk more about the implications of penal substitutionary atonement on just the conception of God that we have in the evangelical world, because I think that's important. But first, I want to go to Nate and just ask you, like, how do you feel like your imagination has changed over the years, or where did you start? Where are you now?
Yeah, man. I was trying to think that whole time. I was really connecting with what Eric said, and yeah, I think that, you know, as a kiddo, when I was reading through, I don't know why, but I feel like I was really connected to like the Old Testament just as a kid, and which seems weird, but I spent a lot of time in like middle school, high school reading just like Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, surprisingly. And so I feel like that, you know, the connecting with the anger of God, and like, yeah, God did this because we messed up, you know, much like God cast Adam and Eve out of the garden because, you know, of his, because they broke their promise with him. And, you know, that, I don't know, the Old Testament stories, especially, so like what I'm thinking of is the garden, the flood, and Sodom and Gomorrah, and just like the Levitical code. It paints God in a light of like wrathful, vengeful, angry, you know. And so I guess that was always kind of what I connected Christ's atonement with. And as I've gotten older, I've definitely starting to see it more. I've started to see it less as vengeful and angry and more loving, and that's been just really good and just like really nice to see for me. And I don't know, it's just part of my you know, my own story. And it's like, man, I don't want to, if like, I don't know why. Well, I know why God's angry with me, but I don't know what to do about it. You know, I'm hoping that Christ's atonement is enough to appease God's anger in that, you know. And now it's like, no, I understand more that Christ's atonement is atoning in a restorative way, less in like a corrective way. It's more like restoration. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
great. That's great. Thank you. Yeah. So for me as well, I think I grew up in a very like Romans reading church, right? So the idea of like the penalty, the wages of our sin is death, like that.
Yep.
Very legalistic, I would say, is the way I would. That's and kind of judicial, right? The picture was painted again and again and again of God being the just judge who's standing and this it even like this was like our idea of how we should evangelize to people is just get them to kind of admit some really small like and things that like even like humans would be pretty quick to forgive, like sins that they had committed. And then once we had done that, we would say, well, God was going to hate you forever if you don't accept Jesus because of those sins, right? The time you lied when you were 6, the time, have you ever stolen a candy bar from the store? Like those kinds of, very subtle ways of explaining our sinfulness. Now, obviously, most people's sinfulness goes a lot deeper than that. And we were merely caricaturizing it and not wanting to put people in the sense of feeling like there was fire and brimstone. But I think what we traded off on is then it just seemed like God was really capricious and like he cared about these tiny little things that like my dad would forgive me of, but like God was somehow incapable of forgiving me of without some external apparatus. And then that's the other thing that's really concerning about an overly strong emphasis on penal substitutionary atonement, which is kind of what I grew up with, is that Jesus becomes the external apparatus, this kind of like shield from the Father's wrath, as if he is not a representation of the Father, as he says he is. He says, "You've seen me, you've seen the Father," right? But we're here thinking Jesus is the nice, like, fluffy God, and the other one is kind of like this angry orb that follows us around and is like zapping people, a very Zeus-like God that just kind of is unable to control himself, not long-suffering even a little bit. But he had this gift to give in the shield, so he gave us the shield so that he could blast the shield with all his might and it would be fine. Right, like, and it's, I mean, like, you paint it that way and you're like, oh man, this is not this is not a very like compelling vision of who God is. And also God just kind of becomes like split down the middle in this weird way. And so like I Nate, what you were saying earlier about like the wrath of God that we see clearly throughout the especially the beginning of the Old Testament. I think like I'm still reckoning with that and trying to figure out exactly how to read that, but I'm more convinced than ever that Jesus is the representation to us of what the Father is like, and Jesus is the God of Israel. And so like what that then means for how we read the rest of the stories, I'm not quite sure yet, but I want to lean heavier on Jesus than on my first understanding of what the Old Testament is telling us. And not to go Marcionitic or anything, but how do we wed these two without forgetting that God is the one who died on the tree for us, right? So, Nate, did you have something you wanted to share?
Oh, yeah. I mean, while you were talking, I was just thinking of an analogy to describe that kind of like old school thought or the way that I did view it before. It's kind of like I kind of viewed God as like a judge, who wanted to put like who wanted to give you the harshest penalty, and Jesus was kind of like the public defender who's like, hey, come on, man, like they're not so bad, like, hey, and he's kind of going to battle for us, and not, not trying to let the judge just give us all that. So in my mind, my cousin Vinny was coming to my head, and that judge in that movie, who is, a hard nose. So anyway.
And which goes right against what the Old Testament says, that God is, I mean, literally in the Hebrew, long of nose, right? Like long suffering, not long fused, right? So even the Old Testament paints a picture of God that is not the way that you could say a boiled down version of penal substitutionary atonement does. Like it's not as harsh. So.
I resonate, I thought it was fascinating because you've related this to two things. One, the character of God. The reason the atonement is important is because it says something about God's character and who He is.
Yes.
And it says something about the person of Jesus Christ and who He was when He walked the earth and to this day. And secondly, to evangelism, how people perceive that. Like how we're saying that how we are portraying God and His character Himself to people. Yeah, that's all really important. I think I want to be careful with our language here because, like, we're going pretty hard against the language of judge and legal status and things like that. But I don't want to outright deny both of those things either because, like, for example, like, God is a judge. He is the judge. Genesis 18:25 says, "Will not the Lord, the judge of all the earth, do right?"
Yeah.
And so, and on top of that, in the Old Testament, like, God takes sin super serious, like very serious.
Oh, absolutely.
I was just listening to something on the conquest of Canaan, which is a notoriously difficult passage in the Old Testament and one we might talk about at some point.
Yeah, we need to. Yeah.
But like, people, atheists in particular, love to take that passage and like question the morality of God Himself based off of that one. But like, one of the biggest like failures of people critiquing that, at least I don't think it's taken seriously enough, is like how seriously corrupted like Canaan and the people of Canaan were. Like, it was really, really bad. Like, like our culture in the West today just simply can't fathom some of the things that were happening in Canaan at that time. Like, particularly sexual exploits of women and children, literally child sacrifice, like literally burning your children alive type stuff. And I don't mean to be graphic, but I have to convey the point as well. Is like, God takes that very seriously, and He is the judge over, and He will do right, as Genesis says, over those issues as well. So I don't mean to come on like too strong with my language there, but what I'm trying to highlight here is there's a balance between these things. Like, Jesus Christ does in His character represent the character of the Father, and there is nobody more compassionate, more patient, as you've put, Jacob, more long-suffering than the example of Jesus Christ. And that's, as you said, a reflection of the Father. But at the same time, like, the danger on the other side is like a laxness towards the seriousness of God towards sin, and my sin as well, in particular. So I would agree with you. Nitpicking, like, I stole a candy bar at the store is probably not going to be helpful for most people when we're portraying the atonement and the character of God there. But like, we also like have to be careful that like we also don't want to like de-emphasize the seriousness of people's sin and their status legally before God, the implications of that as well when we're evangelizing. So that's why this whole talk is so complicated, is because where is that balance? What does the text say?
On that same point, it's funny how quickly we could switch given the scenario where we'll say, like, it's just stealing a candy bar. Why can't God forgive? I mean, that's ridiculous. Why does He need this, like I said, an external apparatus? Or why does He need to, like, create this whole movement of people that slaughter His Son in order to show us the forgiveness, or to create the forgiveness, however you see it, for like something as small as that. However, at the same time, when you have a murderer or a rapist in prison who then like converts to Christianity and is like, God has forgiven me, people go up in arms because they're wait a minute.
Did you ever see the whole thing with Jeffrey Dahmer as well?
Yeah.
I'm not going to speculate on like the conclusions of that, but people freaked out about that one.
Yes.
Like big time. Go ahead. It's us saying like sin isn't serious until it is,
right? And we're very willing to say God needs to be a just judge over someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, right?
Right.
And yet we're unwilling to say that when it comes to the smaller of sins. So you're right. There is a place where like we need to take seriously that justice needs to be done and that forgiveness is no slight thing, right? And so I really love the idea of the crucifixion being, in addition to all of the things that are, you could say effectual for our salvation, a display of how far God is willing to go to restore his creation. That God is willing to let his creation kill him in the process. And that in the resurrection then tells us, and that isn't the end, right? Like even God's death cannot be his end, right? And so, we talk about the death of God in our society and this constant idea of like, we disrespect God so much and we have so little belief in him that it's almost as if we've killed God, right? This is the Nietzschean idea.
Yep.
And the funny thing is that we didn't kill God. The Jews and Romans killed God
Yes.
in 33 AD or right around there, right? Like this is a historical event that's already taken place, and he rose from it. So what are we worried about, as Christians? Like, oh no, the church is in the decline. It's like, yeah, but God rose from the dead. So like, what are we worried about here? Like, it shows at the same time that like God is willing to endure the most grievous of brutality and mocking in order, like, and is still willing to forgive those who mocked and destroyed him. And of anybody who was, you could say, destroyed on earth and abused and mocked and like treated horrendously, Jesus is up there with the people, right? And so where anybody says like I have a right to justice, Jesus can come in and say, hey, me too, and yet I'm willing to stand up for my accuser. Are you, right? So anyhow, okay, I'll shut up now.
Yeah. Nate, what were you looked like you had something to say. So no, Nate.
I don't think so.
Nate gave the most no response. He's like, no, do not talk. I have nothing.
No, I don't think so. Genuinely, if I gave that face, then I was thinking about something else. But no, sorry about that.
No worries. I was just thinking this might be a good chance to like maybe canvas some biblical texts and maybe give a reason why I still are kind of like my conception of penal substitutionary atonement at the moment. And I'll say from the outset too, like to kind of answer that one question that I posed earlier, because it had me thinking there for a minute. And to be frank, I still have to do work on the atonement. Like I got a lot more to read. But something I found helpful for me at the moment is something written by Francis Turretin, and I'll read that as well. But for me, like, I think the strongest text for penal substitution that I've seen or that I can think of at the moment is Isaiah 53. Like him being pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. That's the wrath of God. I don't know how else to say it, like there's clearly some element of that, the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 taking on like a wrathful punishment in some sense in that text. I can't get away from that. If you guys want to push back against me with that, I'd love to hear it. But that's a big one for me for penal substitution. And then people debate the texts in 1 John that talk about propitiation in chapters 2 and 4, I believe it is. The debate is over that word hilasmos in Greek, whether or not that entails an appeasement of wrath of some sort. Because there was, in the history of translation, not to be too boring here, but like in the past it's been translated expiation, And at times it's been translated propitiation, which have
Right.
two very different meanings. Expiation,
And what are those different meetings? Yeah.
expiation meaning a sort of cleansing from sin or a riddance of sin, a very positive outlook on the word, you could say.
Right. Right.
Propitiation meaning, as I said, like a taking on of wrath.
Yeah. Making someone who's angry not angry anymore.
Yeah. I am inclined to take it as propitiation because I had a really smart Greek professor who thinks it's propitiation. So
You're
who am
also
I?
going
Yeah.
to an SBC, so
That's true.
yeah,
That's also
not-
true. I'm fair.
Not
that's fair.
not entirely surprising.
No, not yeah. That's fair. That's totally fair. But yeah, the guy's a genius though. So I'm not going to oppose him at the moment. But I'm willing to be corrected. If
He gets
if
a
there's
pass because his
some strong-
IQ is
Yeah,
higher.
yeah, pretty much. Anyways, so yeah, like First John saying he's the propitiation for our sin. If that does in fact mean that Christ is, in some sense taking on the wrath of God, that would be another one for penal substitution at the moment. So yeah, those two texts, and there's others, of course. They're all throughout the New Testament. There's clear talk about some sort of exchange going on between Christ and us, Christ and God. That's happening, and most people, I don't think, would deny that in some sense. The question is how that gets teased out. And so to wrap up my long speech here at the moment, here's what Francis Turretin says about penal substitution and why I wouldn't go so far as to say that Christ took on damnation for us. Like, Christ was not damned is what I mean by that. Like, Turretin says, it was not necessary when Christ was suffering the punishment due to sin that he should suffer that despair and gnashing of teeth, which are part of the punishment of the damned. For these are not essential to the punishment which the judge inflicts, or which the surety must bear. They are mere circumstances which arise from the character of the persons of the damned, who, when they find their torments are overwhelming and eternal, sink into utter despair and gnashing of teeth. This could not be so with Christ, who in the midst of his greatest agonies had full assurance of deliverance and resurrection from the tomb, and hence, when encompassed by tortures the most excruciating, always manifested his faith in God. My God, are his words. So, yeah, he essentially what he's saying is damnation isn't an essential component to the wrath of God being put upon Christ in that. So Christ does take on the wrath of God in some sense, but it's not necessary that has to include damnation within the concept.
It's about the willingness.
Yes. And he ties that to the character of the persons who are damned, because their damnation rises out of their own character, as he puts it, and that couldn't have rose out of Christ because of his perfection. So,
Yeah.
okay, long-winded, but that's kind of my view of penal substitution at the moment.
Nate, I have a response, but do you have anything you want to share on that?
I don't. Feel free.
All right. So I like that you said when you're talking about Isaiah that that is the wrath of God, because I think that you're right, and that's the context we need to understand it in. But I think that what we often like to do with that is we like to parse out the Trinity too much, so that the Father is the one inflicting on the Son. Both Father and Son are judges, and both Father and Son are there in the crucifixion. The Son is incarnate, suffering, but the Father is not devoid, right? It's not like he's gone, right?
Yeah.
And so I have to believe that if what Jesus said is true about, I am in the Father is in me, that whatever we see on the cross this is the way that Bart puts it, and I love this. He says, he's the judge judged in our place, right? So he is the judge, and he is the one being judged. He is both. And the way that I kind of almost try to like analogize this to us is it's when I swallow my wrath, right? That I'm genuinely forgiving. And so the cross actually becomes a display of the cost of forgiveness, which is the suffering of the person that has to forgive, because they're taking the deficit onto themselves, right? So if let's say, okay, here's a good example. So my stepmom had this window that she and my dad bought on their first date. It was like an antique window, and it was in our house. And I was staying with them at the time. This was probably about 5 or 6 years after they had gotten married. And so this was kind of like an artifact of their early years of dating, very special to my stepmom. I was an idiot, and I was throwing around a bouncy ball, and I'll let you guys put 2 and 2 together about what happened there. I threw it, I missed the door that I was aiming at, and it went right through that window. And I was like, oh man. But of course I'm thinking, it's not that big of a deal. It's just a window. I didn't realize that this was like an antique that they had bought on their first date, right? I was like, oh my gosh. So I told Syl, my stepmom, and she was like, I mean, she was distraught about it, right? Understandably so, because this is a huge deal to her, very sentimental. And she did not, like, I mean, like, I was at the point where I was like, I think I'm gonna get kicked out of the house. Like, this is really bad. Like, I've made a really big mistake here. And she swallowed her wrath, took the deficit, didn't make me pay anything, didn't like come home. There was no huge talk that I got when I got home. We hugged it out and we called it a day. And that was her forgiving, right? So on the cross, I think what we need to see is not the wrath of God, like, on this poor innocent soul, and that's the highlight of who God is. What we need to see is God swallowing his own wrath on himself and saying, you know what, I love you so much that I'm gonna take the deficit here. I'm gonna suffer so you don't have to. And that is the heart of God, and that's the only way to me that makes God loving, because if we see God as the Father proper, right, as which is I think a heresy in and of itself, if the Father is only God and Jesus is somehow secondarily God, right? When Jesus dies, what we see then of the Father, which it doesn't even say that the Father is like punishing. I mean, like, I don't know where we're getting that. Like, that's not does it? Like, can you think of a text where it specifically says the Father laid out the wrath on the Son? Or is it just that the Son took wrath? Or, like, I mean, more passive, more like, I can't think of a passage where it says specifically that the Father lays out wrath on the Son, right? But if we think of the Father as primary God, then what that says to us is God is capricious and angry, and he wants to, lay out his wrath. But if we see God as Trinitarian, which is the way that the church has always seen, or has for as long back as we can really recall, has seen God, then God is the one who, in the Father and Son, swallows the wrath that he has for humanity into himself. He's the judges himself in our place, right? So there's my 2 cents on wrath and the way that we need to see it. It's not that the wrath, that we get rid of wrath. God isn't wrathful. It's that we see the wrath in the context of where it goes, which is into God's own self.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you would disagree with kind of the way I portrayed Isaiah 53 there in a sense, because the way I kind of read that, but now I'm seeing how you could read it differently. Like, the piercing for our transgressions and the crushed for our iniquities and the chastisement that brought us peace is primarily coming from human beings then, rather than the Father, is the way you would understand that?
Well, no, so I mean, I think that you could say that the people who were crucifying Christ are the vicarious, you could say that they're the surrogate vessels of wrath.
Okay.
Meaning, like, so Assyria punishes Israel
Yes.
but
Yes.
Assyria has very different motives in mind,
Yeah.
right? Than punishing Israel.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think Acts 2 that would back that up. That talks about the crucifixion that the people of Israel brought on Christ was divinely arranged by
Yes.
God
Yeah.
Himself. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that would okay.
I think it is Acts 2. It's in
Yeah.
Acts. I don't know if it's Acts 2, but
Okay, so there's sort of a dual nature to it, is how you would see it. Okay.
yes.
Yeah, I like the way that you put it. You said that God swallows up His wrath. How'd you say it again? God swallows up His wrath in Himself, or something
Yes.
like that.
He takes the wrath into himself.
Yeah, that's an insightful way of putting it. Yeah, I think I'm with you so far. Okay. I was just seeing if you would push back on that way I read Isaiah 53, because you said there's no text that talks about punishment, but I don't know.
Right. Well, and so I would say for that text, it's not specifically saying that the Father punishes the Son, right? That's what I'm looking for. Is like, I don't think that there's any text that says that the Father specifically punishes the Son, but that is what penal substitutionary atonement, in its popular conception, leans really heavily on, is this idea of like the Father, like a specific role of the Trinitarian persons, where role placement, where the Father is the punisher and the Son is the sufferer,
Okay.
and the Spirit is nowhere to be seen. I don't know.
So okay,
Spirit doesn't matter.
let me make sure. Let me make sure I'm following you here. So, the idea of wrath, the wrath of God being swallowed up within God Himself, is a Trinitarian act, rather as an economic function within the Trinity. You would say, where the Father has a particular role that's played in the atonement, and Christ has a particular role. You would not see there being roles in that
Right.
in that sense.
Good, yeah. So, no, I would say it's not the Father punishing the Son. It's God judging God's self in our place.
Okay, so it's an
So
entirely Trinitarian act. There's no particular role within it.
That's, yes. The only sense in which there's a role is that Jesus is the incarnate one. So we see Him suffering, but God is incarnate in Him, right?
Okay.
And so it's not that the Father is absent Jesus on the cross.
Okay, I have to
God-
bring up my God, why have you forsaken me?
I was
How
about
do
to
you-
say,
yeah. Okay.
Yes, God cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the craziness of it. It's not, and of course, Jesus is God and man, and we need to read both. So I think there's a way in which also it is showing the humanity of God that is in Jesus descending down to separation. But I also think that we need to read that as, it is incarnate. He is incarnate God. And so it's not that he's saying, because again, he doesn't say, Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? He says, God, God, right?
Okay.
My God, my God.
Okay, let me. You have me curious. I'm gonna stretch you further just because I'm.
Sure, do it.
Yeah, you're interesting me here. So, what about? I'm sure it's in a couple of the different gospels. So I'll just say the gospels generally, but I think it's in Matthew for sure. When Christ says, when Christ is praying to the Father and says, "Father, let this cup pass from me," would that not seem to indicate roles to you in that? Like the Father has a cup for the Son to drink, and that cup being wrath, you could say.
Well, firstly, I don't think that we can read the Father. Again, I'm really trying to pull heavily on John and his understanding of Jesus as, or his understanding of the Son, I'll say, as being one with the Father, right?
Yeah.
And not trying to read in any kind of divisions. So, what I would say there is the cup that the Father has for the Son to drink, the Father is there with the Son. It's not like top is Father, bottom is Son, and the cup is passing down. It's the the Father is so Jesus speaking to the Father is God speaking to God, and saying this is gonna suck. Like, are we sure we want to do this, right? And because otherwise you have like this, and again, so this is specifically reading it from the Jesus is God perspective. And then if you also want to read it from his divine humanity, which has to be kept separate, but is unified, right, in the personhood, which means, I think, you almost have to, like, the people have tried to parse out where Jesus' humanity is coming into play and where his divinity is coming into play in any given situation in the Gospels, in the life of Christ. And I think that actually divorces and tries to disunite the natures too much. So
Okay.
I would say you have to read almost every passage as both, right? It's God and
Okay.
the human.
So let me throw this out here then. I'm curious how you respond to this. Would you say it's appropriate language to say the Father was crucified on the cross, or the Holy Spirit was crucified on the cross?
So the only reason I wouldn't say that is because the Son is the incarnate person.
Okay.
That for some reason that's a really strong Trinitarian belief that you see in the early church. So I'm not a Patripassian. I don't believe the Father is incarnate in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say, so this is a way that I've heard it said before, and I like this. I like the way that this is put. Is through the Son's suffering, the Father and Spirit learn to suffer. So they're there with Jesus in the garden and on the cross. It's not that I want to protect from the cross and the garden becoming these places where Jesus is like somehow isolated away from the rest of the Trinity.
Sure.
Like that, because that can't be, right? Or otherwise you have this like really big question of
division in the Godhead. Yeah.
right, exactly. So
Yeah.
I it's not like the cross is the one place where the Trinity divides itself. It's the full of God is there in Christ dying. But the Son is the incarnate one. And beyond that is mystery to me. Like, I don't know how to parse those two, but I think they both are true.
So, okay. I'll have to chew on more what you're saying here. I'm not sure what to think of it at the moment, but
I appreciate you pushing. I haven't actually considered all of this to its furthest, so I'm thinking on the fly a little.
Yeah, so, like, I'm trying to pinpoint your idea of distinction, of the distinction and role within the Trinity, the function of each person of the Trinity, you might say.
There is no functional difference for me.
I thought you might say that, but you would
Difference in persons, but
sure. Okay. I think I'm going to stop myself there for now because I'm not sure how to word some of my questions. So
yeah.
Can I try
But,
to summarize us a little bit just on this last
Yeah,
point? 'Cause
please do.
What
Yeah.
I'm hearing,
we should
from-
wrap up anyways.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
got to get going.
But just on this last point, what I'm hearing from Jacob is that you don't want to minimize the presence of God the Father and God the Spirit at the cross. So you want to make sure that they're present and still attentive in that moment. And what I hear from Eric, the pushback on that is you don't want to minimize the role of Christ on the cross. So it's kind of a fine balance of like, hey, where do we see the God? Where do we see God the Father and God the Spirit in the cross? And also, let's make sure to keep Christ in his proper role as well. That's kind of what I see. Would you say that that's accurate?
Christ in his proper role within his human nature. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm
Jacob?
just trying to, from your perspective, Eric, pushing back on Jacob's assertion in God the Father being present at the cross is to maintain Christ's proper role or proper, just like, I don't know, hierarchical stance in that moment. Not to not minimize Christ's role on the cross. Essentially, that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, no, Nate, from what I understand, I think that's a good way of characterizing, not caricaturizing. Sorry, characterizing the debate here.
back and
Yeah,
forth.
and Eric, the question about his humanity, like I said, you have to read every passage, I think, from both perspectives, and like, and I think at the same time that can actually confront, and this is the crazy thing, is that can confront some of our assumptions about what it means for God to be God. So as we read Jesus, we're being told that God is being revealed to us, but are we willing to take that to its furthest conclusions? That's, I guess, what I'm trying to tease out right now.
Sure.
So, but yeah, I'm still working through all this in my own mind as well.
Yeah. Maybe we should do a part two, but maybe, Jacob, do you want to maybe give a brief summary or something along the lines of that and then wrap us up?
Sure. So today we were setting out to talk about the atonement, and I think we ended up talking a lot about, like, we kind of summarized the 6 different, or the 7. You offered 2 other ones, so 8 different kind of models for understanding the atonement that have been traditionally seen in the church, in its history. And we ended up talking a lot about whether or not the way that we grew up understanding penal substitutionary atonement is viable for our current understanding, whether it was too emphasized, whether there were parts of it that were too simplified, and how we should understand penal substitutionary atonement even today. And so I think that was, am I right in saying, I think that's where it ended up?
All of us kind of, it still sounds like in some sense, like are holding to penal substitutionary atonement, depending
Yes.
upon how you tease that out. So
Yes.
we canvassed all of the theories, but then, of course we're going to talk about the theory that that we kind of hold to at the moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So and then it kind of we kind of got into the roles or the distinctions in the persons of the Trinity in penal substitutionary atonement, and what it then means for how we see God and the Trinity in light of what we've been taught growing up, and how we how we parse all that out. I think that's kind of where we ended. So one thing I'd love to like maybe get your like really brief reaction on, and then we'll talk about this in the next episode, kind of to just do a little cliffhanger here, is I would love to know whether you guys are unlimited atonement or what might be called general atonement, or limited atonement in your understanding. And what that means is, did God in Jesus Christ, did he die for everyone, or did he die for the chosen, the elect? Was it limited to just those who God knew he was going to save, or was the death for the entirety of the world? So I'll jump mine out there and say I am currently in the unlimited atonement camp. Eric, what about you?
Yeah, I guess you could say I'm in. I stay away from the language of limited now. Like, I would prefer like a perfect atonement or a particular. I could even maybe be okay with, but yeah, sure, limited atonement.
You said unlimited or limited?
Limited.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Interesting.
But I don't.
Okay.
But I don't like that language.
So you'd say particular or perfect, you said?
Yeah, something along the lines of that.
Interesting. I want to know more about that. Okay. And Nate, if you were to take a stab.
Yeah, if I were to stab you, no.
Nate, if you were to stab me.
Yeah, where would I do it? No. I would say unlimited atonement, and I would say that the limitation comes from the person, not from Christ, not from God.
Okay, yeah.
So,
That's funny. So I feel like I'm like in the Bardian camp, so it makes sense with mine. Eric, you're more in the like traditional Calvinist camp, which makes sense of yours.
Yeah.
And Nate, you were raised Nazarene, so that makes sense of yours. So that's hilarious. All right, well, and we'll duke it out some other time. But thank
Eric's
you guys
ready to go
for
now. I
listening.
can see it in his face.
Yeah. I asked a really hot question there. The next time we record, we will talk about that, or sometime down the line. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Triclinium. If you would like to reach out to us, have any questions, comments about, especially if you have some questions about what we talked about today, because this was a complicated one, reach out to us. You can reach out to our email address. It's sophomorosofficial@gmail.com. That's SOPHOMOROS official@gmail.com. And we would love to hear from you, and maybe your question or your comment will get incorporated onto one of our episodes in the future. And as always, may Christ be exalted.